What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Sit Down Saturday, and I know what you're thinking already. You're thinking two things, and I know. You're thinking, last week I told you that this stuff was all coming back and not to get used to it being a clean table surface, and it is. It's coming back this afternoon. It's just the way it worked out. I had a separate project going on. Don't get used to this. I know it looks nicer in here without all that stuff, but all that stuff is required to do Nerd Rage Radio, the weekly podcast. So it's coming back. The second thing you're thinking is, Bobby, you still haven't replaced that light bulb. And you're right. I'm hoping at some point during this show it'll come back on. We'll have to wait and see. So today we're going to talk about Inferno, and I have no real interest in just when one toy is revealed to kind of have a discussion about that toy, but I did get a lot of people hit me up about this. So in my mind I was like, okay, people want to talk about it, but I can't do it in the kind of typical fashion that perhaps other people would. I had to find some sort of meat on that bone, so to speak, in order to have a real conversation about it, and I was able to find one, so we're going to talk about it. The conversation is really about the difference in competition and how it's changed. But before we get there, we do have to do a little housekeeping. For one, the Optimus Prime. I was actually surprised in the comments of how many people didn't like it or didn't seem to like it, because I thought it was quite good, and in comparison to the last Takara masterpiece I looked at, I thought it was far superior, especially for its price point. It's not a little unit, but apparently I was in the minority there, or not in the minority perhaps, but I was in a split conversation at the very least that I didn't realize. Secondly, the Ghost Shooter. That is definitely a retool, right? But it's definitely the same mold. They've redone some things, and someone has said that I think they've perhaps perfected that mold at this point with this release, and I would go so far to agree with that. I think that they're right. I think that this is the best overall comprehensive sort of release of that mold. I would agree with that. And then we had the diorama video, which just went up a couple hours ago and seems to be getting a fair response. I don't know, there's too much to talk about there. And the same day that this is going up, the Patreon review for the HasLab Sentinel is going up as well. Or it should, if I got it done in time. So with that being said, we can get into this. Now, this figure was revealed some time ago, and it was revealed to mixed reviews because of the armature that the head box is connected to and a lot of other stuff that coincided with a very sketchy reputation regarding X-Transbots at the time. X-Transbots' reputation has drastically changed since then. And in turn, so has the response to the re-reveal, if you will. And they gave you all 4 of their intended releases required of the mold. Emphasis on intended, because if the first couple aren't successful, you're not going to see them, would be my guess. But I think they have a good chance of being successful, even though a lot of people have checked Inferno off their list, and that's for a number of different reasons. But before we get into all that, let's take a quick second and just talk about this as the CAD images were revealed. Let's talk about them and how we feel about them. So let's take a minute and look at them. Now, for the most part, I think that we should point out first and foremost that it looks like the only real retooling here is with the heads and the head buckets. And even the head buckets might be more accessory oriented than it is actually retooling, but they do have different helmets. There are differentiations regarding their face sculpts, etc. But let's start with the Dante, and then we'll briefly touch on the others. And I like this a lot. I actually was thinking a lot about this design, and it's definitely a sign of its times where a lot of companies were able to kind of put their own flavor on stuff and have their own identity regarding them. And as a result, I think what we get is something that's unique, cool, updated, modern, and yet very nostalgic. So I dig it a lot. I think it looks great. It's obvious that all of these are going to have the ladders, cranes, etc. attached to them, but hopefully there'll be a way to detach them if you want to just put them in the box. But I like the flare. I like the proportions of how big the legs are. In particular, I dig stuff like that. When the upper body looks kind of disproportionately small to the lower body, to me, it makes them look bigger. I've said this 1,000 times, but now is no different. I think that the fire truck looks cool. Looks old, but it should. Has all the little flare and bells and whistles and stuff on the side. And then inside, it looks like they've done a pretty detailed job of the console and the steering wheel and the gear shift and all those sorts of things. So that attention to detail is cool as well. I'm not sure that I'll ever be able to appreciate it if I were even going to buy this, but if I was, I'm not sure I was going to be able to appreciate this because I probably wouldn't keep it in alt mode. That being said, it's cool that it's in there. Now, then we obviously get the grapple representation, which is called Da Vinci, which is a clever name and pretty much par for the course, exactly what you would expect. Looks good to me. Head sculpt perhaps is a little off base for the character, but I'm not mad at it. It just looks mean, and he really wasn't that type of character, which is fine. It's cool, it makes him more tough, but just stands out to me. And then you get the green version,
which I think a lot of people initially kind of try to throw under the flag of hauler, but it ended up not being hauler. It's like the Japanese toy release, I believe, or something like that. Don't quote me on that. I don't know. But if you're into that, you're going to get that as well, it looks like. And then the Artfire one without a crowdfunding. So that's nice as well. Now, it has been pointed out to me to take note of a couple things. One of which being, I'm not entirely sure that the ladders and cranes have been totally worked out in regard to the vehicle modes. It's been pointed out to me that it looks like they're just sitting there in CAD, that it hasn't completely been worked out. And also that if you look at the back, the green truck is perhaps the best example, that the blurred out box elements of the back of it are perhaps an indication that that's not completely fleshed out either. Now, all of this will eventually connect to the armature that lays across the back of the fire truck, but I'm talking specifically about where the armature of the crane or ladder meets the head box. I have a feeling that this transformation might be a little aggravating as well. Now, we have seen, obviously, a 3D print of this figure in the past, but I'm not sure if it hasn't been reworked and retooled since then. But we've seen the 3D print both in robot mode and in alt mode, and obviously it worked to some degree there. So I'm sure that they'll work it out. It's just an indication more so, specifically that we got all CAD here and not a test shot. I don't think we've ever seen a test shot of this, just high quality 3D print prototypes and CAD images, which is fine. Once again, it just suggests that we're still quite a far way away, perhaps, from actually receiving these figures in our mailbox.
But that's not really what's interesting to me about this release. What's interesting to me about this release is how the competition sorts out. So, one thing that was smart about X-Transbots in this regard was because of the plethora of Infernos out there that kind of were staggered. There was first the Make Toys, and then there was the MMC sometime later, a little bit later, and then there was the Takara sometime later, and now X-Transbots has waited yet another bit of time to release theirs, and I think that's just enough to kind of gather the bag on all three, or four, I guess. But I think what's interesting is if we think about the Inferno Wars, that this is now starting to conclude, if we think about them, and we think about the difference between when the Hellfire from Make Toys and the Backdraft from MMC started versus, let's say, the Takara Inferno versus the X-Transbots Inferno, and just how that has changed. And I think it's worthwhile taking a minute talking about all of them and talking about the difference in competition between those figures then and what we see more like today.
So let's talk about each one for a bit and then sort of look at them all together. So the Make Toys one sort of followed suit with the typical Make Toys design that we were used to. All of that Make Toys stuff, especially from that era, all looked like it came from the same universe, which I still to this day hold on to the idea of being super cool. It was like Fans Project and Make Toys were their own Transformers universe, and it worked. And I miss stuff like that. But I always liked this design. Of the first two, this was my personal favorite, subjectively. I can't remember what the objective versus was, and I think I did one, but I can't remember what the outcome was. But this was the one that I bought back then, and the one that I had in my collection, I think, until the Takara. But it had those Japanese proportions, that super stylized look. It definitely had its own flavor. And then came the MMC one from Ocular Max, not too far behind, with their more Studio Ox inspired, proportion-wise was also completely different, had more of the toy aesthetic cues as well as a longer torso, but once again definitely had its own character and its own beat to which it walked to. Now these were both somewhat put to bed by the Takara release, which is a straight G1 cartoon attempt at capturing the character. Gone are the days of sophisticated sculpts, gone are the days of line work, and what is left is red box on top of red box on top of red box on top of black box on top of truck cab with head on top, which is the one that I have, to be fair, despite my criticisms, but once again a sign of its time. And then we have the X-Transbots, which to me sort of takes a page out of the original book that Fans Toys was playing by, which they have since discarded as well, which is a heavy tune inspiration with a modern update sculpt-wise. So the line work is back if we look at the calves. The rear bumper can show on the toes of the feet. Sculpt work is back in the pelvis as well. And it's not necessary to completely hide the ladder, let's be honest, because they probably didn't figure it out, but also because when this toy was originally designed, literal cartoon translations were not at all the goal. So if we look at all four together, what we have are four distinct representations of Inferno, each pretty unique from the other, while all clearly capturing some element of the character where it's definitely recognizable, it's instantly evident who it's supposed to be, and yet they're all clearly and distinctly different. But 3 of these came from a very different time. So let's compare that to a more modern representation that we can see with Springer. Now, are all 3 of these different in their own way? Of course. But do all 3 of these have their own distinct identity in the way that Inferno does? In my opinion, absolutely not. These Springers are all competing for the exact same space in your collection. A far cry from the Infernos. And as a result, I think you're less likely to buy multiples of these. And what I mean by that is different representations from different companies, unless you were going for some alt mode aesthetic, because there's not enough different about the 3 to warrant a different purchase. I remember people having multiple Infernos, or they would get one Inferno and one grapple from different companies to kind of make them distinct a bit. That option's kind of out the window in the current climate of third-party competition. And I think this is a clear example of that.
And I mean, I could go on and on with examples. If we looked at the Predacons from years ago, and we looked at the difference between Unique Toys TFC and MMC, if we looked at even the Mirages, if we looked at like the DX9 Mirage versus the MMC Mirage of its time and compared that to what we see with the Transform Element Mirage versus the Fans Toys Mirage, it's pretty much the same thing that we're talking about, right? The way that competition has evolved in this game has changed from kind of companies competing against each other for their representation of a figure to companies competing against each other for the same figure. And what that means is they're no longer competing in the same space, they're competing for the same space. And how will that affect them in the future? Probably the same way it's affected them over the last 2 years, which is to say, not entirely well. Another thing that they should be pretty cautious of moving forward, in my opinion. I do like this X-Transbots Inferno, but it comes from that time. It comes from the time when Fans Toys was making G1 style masterpiece figures, but putting their own flair on it, putting their own little spin on it, updating it a little bit, making it a little bit more modern, as opposed to the complete cartoon literal translation, which everybody is doing now, and as a result, perhaps makes it a little less interesting and a little harder to really survive competition. Competition is great as long as it doesn't kill all the competitors. And this release has reminded me of the kind of good old days, the golden era of all this stuff, if you will. And that made the conversation worth having for me. So with that, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys are feeling well. TFCon is coming up soon. I will be there with a table. I hope to see you there. I have a lot more information about that as we get a little bit closer. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.